Furina is one of the very best characters in the entirety of Genshin Impact. And guess what? She's here again, having another rerun on the current banner. So, in today's Genshin Impact guide, I'm gonna tell you everything you need to know about Furina in 2025, her kit, weapons, artifacts, teams, and we will of course also take a look at her constellations, just in case you already have a copy of her and are maybe considering doing some vertical investment. But with all that being said, let's jump right into it. Alright, let's start talking about Furina's kit, her abilities, and how she works. First off, I would usually talk about her normal attacks now, but I want to skip over them because Furina is in 99% of the cases an off-field support, so she's not going to use her normal attacks outside of C6, and when it comes to C6, we're going to talk about that later in the video, so let's rather talk about her elemental skill now. This thing goes by the name Salon Solitaire, and it has two different functions. On the one hand, you can use it as a healing ability, where you deploy one sea creature on the field, which will heal your current on-field character over time. All in all, a very good healing ability. However, most of the time you're not going to use it, but rather go for the damaging version of this, where you not only deploy one, but 3 sea creatures on the battlefield, which will then automatically attack nearby enemies, focusing on specifically that enemy that you're currently attacking. Now, the special thing about those sea creatures is that whenever they do attack an enemy, they drain a little bit of the health of every single team member of you. This continues until your team members are down to half of their health, but for every team member that still has more than half of their health, these sea creatures deal more damage. So you're incentivized to always keep your team health above 50%. Now, all in all, Furina's personal damage here scales with her HP and is pretty respectable in terms of the numbers that she deals, but with her 4th Ascension passive, this gets even better because with it, your sea creatures can get up to 25% bonus damage on top, or in case you're using the healing one, up to plus 16% more healing. Now, let's next talk about her Elemental Burst, and this is basically the reason why so many teams out there want to have a Furina, because it is a huge team-wide damage bonus. Let's go over it. Once you cast the burst, the game sort of starts to record how much health your entire team loses or gains. And for every percentage point that your team either loses or gains health, Furina will gain 1 fanfare point. You can have a maximum of 300 fanfare points by default, and depending on how many fanfare points you have, the damage bonus that your entire team gets will increase. At 0 fanfare points, of course, you don't get a damage bonus at all, and at the maximum of 300 fanfare points, that constitutes a 75% team damage bonus if you have her burst at level 10. Now, this whole thing might sound a little bit complicated with the whole percentage up and down and what is a fanfare point even, so to put it in very simple words, what this means is, after you press the burst, you want to make sure that the health of the entire team fluctuates up and down as much as possible to get a lot of fanfare points and therefore reach the maximum damage bonus of 75% as quickly as possible. The way you do this is, you first deploy your sea creatures, who then attack enemies, which, remember, drains the entire team's health, so that already starts gaining your fanfare points then. And then you want to combine Furina, ideally with a team-wide healer, who can continuously heal the whole team back up, so that your entire team is in a constant state of losing health from your sea creatures and gaining health back up from your team-wide healer. This will then give you a ton of fanfare points really quickly, therefore the entire team gets a big damage buff. And as always, it would be super duper awesome if you could maybe leave the video a like, because that would give the video a big buff in the YouTube game. So as always, cheers so much for your support. But alright, now that we all are on the same page about her kit and what she can do, let's finally talk about actually building her, and here I want to start out with her artifacts. See, with Furina, the whole artifact thing is actually really darn simple. Her best in slot set is very obviously the Golden Troop, which you can farm in this domain right here, together with the Maréchaussée set, which is also super duper nice and best in slot on many Fontaine characters, which makes the whole farming also very resin efficient. However, there are other sets which are not really best in slot but still viable. One of them would be the Vurukasha's Glow, I hope I pronounced that right. because the 2-piece bonus gives you plus 20% maximum HP, which is kind of comparable to the 2-piece bonus of Golden Troop. But also here the 4-piece set bonus is relatively cool because it increases elemental skill and elemental burst damage every time that the character takes damage, which for Furina, as we already established, is happening all the time because of her sea creatures that constantly chip away at your health. So I would say if you already have a lot of this specific artifact set, then you can definitely use it. And thirdly, I also want to talk a little bit about Tenacity of the Millilith, which isn't really all that amazing for Furina personally. I mean, sure, it gives you plus 20% HP, which is nice, but the 4-piece set bonus doesn't benefit Furina at all, given a 20% attack bonus to all nearby party members. However, since this attack bonus lasts for 3 seconds and is re-triggered every time that your elemental skill deals damage, this means Furina sea creatures make it very easy to keep this bonus up for a very long time. And just in case your team has one very strong attack scaling DPS character and you want to build the entire team to be just focused around giving as much attack and as much buffing to that one character as possible, then Tenacity of the Millilith might be an option here too, but it's kind of more of a meme situation. So yeah, about the artifact sets, long story short, Golden Troop is her best in slot, and I'm sure most of you are probably going to want to use this. However, you of course also want to know which stats of the artifacts you're actually looking for, and here it is also pretty straightforward. For your circlet, you usually want to go for crit. If you have a crit damage weapon, you want to go for crit rate and vice versa. Healing bonus, I wouldn't really recommend it because, as I said previously, Furina is not really to be used as a healer. For the sands, you ideally go HP because that is what your personal damage and healing scales on, but especially in very energy hungry teams where Furina needs a lot of ER, it might be necessary to go for an ER sands instead. Don't worry, we're gonna talk about the energy in just a minute here. For the goblet, either go HP or hydro damage bonus. I would say hydro damage is a little bit better, but if you have an HP goblet with really beefy substats, then I would actually opt to go for it. As for the substats themselves, highest priority is going to be crit rate, crit damage, but make sure to also focus on energy recharge because Furina wants to burst every single rotation, and if you can't make that happen, that's really bad. And once you have all the crit and ER that you need, the third priority would be HP percent. But now, before we go on to the weapons, let's talk a little bit more about energy recharge requirements. As I said in the skills section, Furina really wants to burst every rotation to make sure that her team has this big damage buff up constantly. So depending on which weapon or which team combination you run, you might need more or less energy recharge for Furina. In case she is the only hydro character in the team, then you're looking at a whopping 200 to 220% energy recharge that you need to ensure that you can burst every rotation. With one additional hydro character, that goes down to 180 to 190%, with 2 hydros 150 to 160%, and in case you're using a Favonius sword, you can reduce all those previous figures by around 20%. Now, one thing to also talk about here would be Constellation 4, just in case you have that or you're aiming for it, because this massively reduces her energy needs by around 50%, but again, more on the Constellations a little bit later. Let's first though talk about weapon options, and luckily, no matter if you're a free-to-play player, a pay-to-play player, or a big whale, for Furina, there's a nice option for all of us. First and foremost, her signature weapon, the Splendor of Tranquil Waters, is naturally very good on her, but compared to other 5-star characters, the buff that she gets from having her signature weapon isn't as impactful because her signature weapon only increases her personal damage output and unfortunately doesn't do anything for her energy recharge. Therefore, if you're using it, then you're kind of forced to go for an ER Sans and invest heavily into ER substats on your artifacts just to ensure that you can burst every rotation. So for most players out there, getting her signature weapon is not something that I would recommend doing. Another very good 5-star option for her, in case you have it already, would be the Key of Kajni Zoot, given her astronomical amounts of maximum HP, which is very good because that is what her damage scales off, and in case you're playing Furina in a reaction team, maybe in a Dendro-based Hyperbloom team for example, then the Key is probably even better than her signature weapon because it gives elemental mastery to all your team members, therefore increasing your reaction damage. But don't worry, Furina not only has good 5-star options. If you're, for example, a Battle Pass buyer, then the Wolf Fang is also a very good option if you want to increase her personal damage as much as possible, kind of like the 4-star substitute for her signature weapon, giving you crit rate, increasing your elemental skill crit rate, and your elemental skill damage. Same problem here though, it doesn't help with your energy recharge, so you gotta have a lot invested into that stat if you choose to get the Wolf Fang. On the other hand though, a very good option that gives you a lot of energy recharge and therefore a bit more breathing room would be the Favonius Sword. I don't think I need to explain all too much here. The Festering Desire, if you have it, is exceptionally great on her, giving you energy recharge plus a lot of personal damage. This is more what I would personally like her signature weapon to be honest. But, and this is great news for all free-to-play players out there, the Fleuve Cendre Ferryman, the pipe sword that you can get from doing the fishing in Fontaine, this, while looking hella ugly to be honest, is also a very formidable weapon on Furina, giving you a ton of energy recharge as well as elemental skill crit rate. But which weapon do you like to use on Furina? Let us know in the comments down below. And now, before we look at her teams, let's also talk about vertical investment into Furina by going over all her constellations, and I'm trying to give you an opinion on whether they are a good option or maybe rather not. Just keep in mind that pulling for constellations on any character is optional and you should not feel forced to do that. Only go for constellations if you already have all the characters that you want or you really love Furina. But with that being said, let's jump right in, and luckily when it comes to constellations, Furina is an absolute powerhouse of vertical investment potential. Her C1 increases your maximum fanfare stacks from 300, which you have by default, to 400. This means that your maximum possible damage bonus that you can get from your ultimate increases from 75% at level 10 to 100% at level 10, but that's not it. What this constellation also does is, you don't anymore start at 0 fanfare points, but once you cast your burst, you already gain 150 right from the start. What this means in raw numbers is, instead of scaling from 0% damage bonus all the way up to 75% damage bonus at level 10, which is the default, with C1 now, you already start at 37.5% damage bonus, scaling all the way up to 100%. This is a very strong constellation, not only for her, but for the entire team. Same thing by the way with C2, this one is also really good. While this does not increase her fanfare stacks, what it does do is, it makes you gain fanfare stacks faster by 250%. But this is not all. What this thing also does is, once you've reached the maximum fanfare limit, Furina will increase her maximum HP, therefore also increasing all her personal damage. If you want to do vertical investment on Furina, but you don't want to spend all too much primors on her, then I think either C1 or C2 are a good early stopping point. C3 increases your elemental burst level, therefore further increasing your maximum damage bonus from 100 to 124%, so that's also very nice, and if you want to invest a little bit more money into Furina, this could also be potentially a stopping point. Her C4, as I previously said in the artifact section, massively reduces her energy recharge requirements by refunding 4 energy every 5 seconds whenever your skill deals damage or does healing. While this constellation does not really increase your personal or the team's damage output, I think overall you can benefit greatly from having this constellation, especially if your artifacts aren't that heavy into energy recharge. But on the other hand, we're getting into the whaley territory with C4 here, so I don't want anyone to believe that C4 is really something that you have to go for. C5 then is decent because it increases your elemental skill level, so more personal damage output, but compared to all the previous constellations, the overall impact on the whole team damage of this isn't all that high, and if you just want to have Furina as the biggest buffer ever, then you don't really need to go past C4. However, C6, and you can also see it here, this does a lot. Now, unfortunately, I am not a whale and my Furina currently is only at C1, so I haven't had the chance to test this one out myself, but what it basically does is, it turns Furina into an on-field DPS character by giving her normal attacks Hydro Damage Infusion, providing a ton of damage bonus to herself in that state, and this is the funny part, When your Furina is on the field with this constellation, then she always does the opposite of her sea creatures from her elemental skill. So if you have the healing character out, she will deal more personal damage, and if you have the damaging creatures out, then she provides team-wide healing by attacking the enemy. All in all, again, I haven't had the chance to test this myself, but people say that for the overall team damage, it's still better to run her as an off-field support and rather go for someone like Neuvillette to be the hyper carry. But if you really love Furina, then I think this right here is a very creative solution and can lead to some interesting team combinations. However, for anyone who is not the biggest die-hard Furina fan out there, this one, as well as C5, in my opinion, is a skip. Whew, that was quite a lot of input, wasn't it? But don't worry, you're done with the building Furina section now. Let's next talk about her team options. And unlike with other characters, for Furina, she's actually so extremely ultra super duper flexible that I can hardly imagine a situation in which she wouldn't at least be viable. This, by the way, is also why I don't want to talk about all of her full team options, because in that case, we would still be sitting here tomorrow, but rather I want to talk about specific team core synergies of one or two other characters that she works very well with, and then for the rest of the team members, you can slot in whatever you like. See, what I mean here is that due to the fact that Furina buffs the team damage and also drains the entire team's health, with her, you're kinda sorta forced to have a team-wide healer with you. Yes, it is true that her first Ascension passive gives her the option to also do a little bit of team-wide healing herself, but in practice, this is by far not enough to compensate for the HP loss from her elemental skill, so for the most benefit, you're still not getting around having a team-wide healer. But luckily, when it comes to team-wide healers, there is a whole plethora of options, so let's go over them step by step. Two characters that always work very well with Furina would be Jean or Xianyun. Both of them not only do team-wide healing and therefore synergize very well with Furina, but since they're both Anemo characters, that means they can also both be equipped with the Viridescent Venerer set, therefore shredding enemies' resistance and further contributing to your team dealing more damage. It should be said though that a drawback here would be that Jean, similar to Bennett, is Circle Impact, and for Xianyun, the problem is that her Swirl almost has no AoE capabilities, so if you're up against one big enemy, that's absolutely no problem. Through her skill, jump at it and swirl the resistance away, but in group content, her Swirl really struggles to hit everybody at the same time, and also she does not have any grouping, so keep that one in mind. So much for the Anemo options, but if you want to play Furina, for example, in a Dendro team, in a Hyperbloom team to be more specific, then Baizhu would be your ideal team-wide healer to go with, not only providing the heal but also the Dendro application. Then we also need to talk about Sijuin, who is a very dedicated 5-star premium support for Furina and almost no one else. But if you have her, she is exceptionally good with Furina, not only providing the team-wide heal, but also buffing Furina's personal damage, or if you, for example, wanted to do Mono Hydro with Neuvillette and Furina, then Sijuin is the option to go for. However, don't worry, there are not only 5-star characters. For example, Charlotte, who also happens to be on this Furina banner, with her C1, you can turn her into a team-wide healer, so if you wanted to do a freeze Furina team, for example, Charlotte would be your girl to go for. But even if you are a completely free-to-play player who doesn't have all the fancy characters in the world, theoretically also Barbara, which is a free character, could work here because her burst does team-wide healing. It should be said though that she is not as ideal as the other characters because her team-wide healing only applies once in one big healing burst and not continuously over time. As for which DPS characters you can combine with Furina, well, pick your poison. There is so much that you could do here. I personally tested her with Neuvillette, which of course is a great synergy, but you could also use her with Wriothesley, who happens to be on the same banner with her. I tested her in Hyperbloom with Clorinde, which also was pretty darn powerful. But not just that, you could also do a Hu Tao team. I used her with Alhaitham, which is pretty strong too. Basically, whichever DPS character you like, slot Furina in the team plus a team-wide healer, and your DPS is going to like it. And in case you want to buff out your team even more, you could also always combine Furina together with Xilonen, who is arguably the second best support character in the game, to absolutely go ham. But yeah, which Furina team is your personal favorite? Also let us know in the comments down below. But before we end the video for today, I also quickly want to talk about Furina's materials in case you haven't fully built her yet. And here, for leveling her up, you need the Lake Light Lilies, which you can find in Fontaine around water usually, the nectars from Whopper flowers, you can easily farm them all over to that, as well as for the Ascension, the Water That Failed to Transcend, which is the boss material that you can get from the Hydrotulpa. As for her talent materials, you need the Justice Scrolls as well as the Lightless Mass, which you can get from the all-devouring Narwhal boss once per week. But if you're planning on pulling on the current banner, then definitely check out this video right here first, because otherwise you might waste a ton of Primo Gems. But anyway, I hope to see you all again in the next one, and until then, as always, travel smart!